This innovation hour of power, actually more than an hour of power. I've invited the Reverend Dr. James Choung to present to us about understanding iGEMs, as this will help us think through and be more um, on target with the discovery, incubation, and acceleration of the tools that we are doing. Take it away, Reverend Dr. James Choung.
Well, it's my pleasure to be on this call. Wow, it's such a surprise to be here on Tuesday morning with you all. Yeah, this is a presentation that I gave to the church group. It really kind of is two presentations slammed together a bit. I'm just trying to get you enough info. There's a third segment that could go a deeper dive into generational theory and turnings and eras and all that business, but we're not going to be able to get to that today. But this is really an introductory pass to the spirituality of each of the generations, and then a little bit of a deeper dive or digging into iGEMs. That is the idea. So I just have this in here for the church world often, is that Jesus also was a generational theorist. He goes on to say, at least in Luke, and generations it is a biblical concept in that it shows up in the scripture a lot about this generation, or sins being paid to the third or fourth generation, or not being paid to the next generation. All that stuff is there. And just that example where Jesus went on to say, to what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? And he goes on to explain how they had this expectation. And then he's sort of subverting that. And so a lot of times the folks in the scripture sometimes look at generations this way. But for us, why we're looking at generations, this comes from an Arab proverb that men resemble the times more than they resemble their fathers. And as much as we as parents, especially if we're parents with kids, that we want to pour into them, they'll take some of our traits, but they'll often look more like their peers in personality than like us. And so it's with that I'm going to dive into this thing. This is a lot of this material comes out of a dissertation that I did for Fuller, and was really interested in the shift philosophically from modernity to postmodernity, as well as the shifts that were happening between each generation. And as I was doing that research, I landed on Strauss and Howe's work. This came out in '91, called Generations, and it was a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller when it came out. And this is Al Gore bought it for every member of Congress. This is kind of a big deal when it came out, and really did a lot to start the thinking around generational theory. And well, it's fascinating. This book reads like an encyclopedia, so I would not suggest necessarily going out and reading it unless you'd like to. But it basically, the premise is they go back and they look through all this stuff, and they go from 1584 and on, and they look at American generations, and what they find is that there's a 4-generational cycle in terms of characteristics. And then from that cycle, like just saying that these 4 repeat, and it repeats unbroken throughout history, except at the Civil War. The Civil War is such a traumatic time for the country that it skips a generation. But otherwise, it keeps the same traits. They've been accused of selective data, reasoning, so they just take data and make it fit into their theory sometimes. But sort of the proof is in the pudding. In '91, then, this is when the book came out, then they predicted, based on this theory, what the millennials would be like. In '91, they were about 8 or 9 years old at their oldest, and they predicted what they'd be like as adults. And they were spot on. And Strauss and Howe then became one of the foremost leaders and experts in the millennial generation. Now that we're shifting, it's very fascinating to see some of this theory play out some more. But then they made predictions out to 2069 about what the millennial generation would be like. And then they didn't write beyond that. Based on that stuff, I just wondered if there were spiritual implications as well. And they do talk about some of those spiritual implications, both in this book and the next book in '97 called The Fourth Turning. And it's a lot of that stuff that I sort of took on and said, hey, maybe there's something for us as we think about ministry. So Strauss and Howe talks about a generation as being a cohort group whose length approximates the span of a phase of life and whose boundaries are fixed by pure personality. And it's not an academic talk to just basically say there's a certain amount of time and they have a certain kind of personality. And not everyone fits in a particular generation. These are major broad brushstrokes, huge generalities. And so there's always exceptions to the rule. But there's a lot of it that seems to hold up. And not even just for Americans. The fourth turning expanded it to Western Europe, and because of, actually all of Europe, because of the way the immigration patterns were linked together. And then a lot of this stuff is getting some sense, particularly now that we're more connected around the world. And I can go into that more if you have questions around that. But this is kind of what they did. And so this is the list of the 17 American generations. And I'm not going to go through each generation, but basically they take it and they go into this 4-generational cycle: prophet, nomad, hero, artist. These are the labels that come from their later book, The Fourth Turning. They use different labels in generation, but it gives you a good sense of these are the types, and you can see it rotating, but it skips the artist generation after the Civil War and goes right into prophet as people were responding back into the craziness of the culture at the time. So there we are, and we're in the millennial cycle of those 4. The prophet cycle is the first of that cycle, and then it moves on to nomad, hero, and artist. And I can explain more later around that, but that is what we're looking at. Oh, I'm explaining more now. Hey, this is a deeper dive than I thought. So in that, then each generation, as they look back on it, seems to have certain callings and endowments that it brings. When you see an asterisk on this chart, that means I'm taking the title from the fourth turning rather than the generations. And just because the fourth turning came out later, there's some things that seem to make more sense. But a prophet generation, they're the idealists. So they're the thinking types, tend to bring out the preachers, the writers, the radicals, the publishers, the teachers. When they're the young adults, spiritual awakening tends to happen. And this is why they surmise spiritual awakenings happen every 80 years or so, the last one being in the 60s and 70s of the Jesus movement. Their endowments tend to be around vision, values, religion. It's really about seeking truth, seeking what's core, seeking the kind of getting us back to what we really should be about, hence the prophet. The nomad generation is in response to that, the Generation X. They tend to be like the entrepreneurs, the brigands, industrialists, generalists, salesmen, the people who sort of do the new thing and take the big risks to try to do the new thing. Generation X is very fascinating that way. They get slammed. The prophet and nomad always are the biggest conflicts between the 4 generations. Those two always have the largest conflict in any cycle. But this is like, it makes sense that the .com era happened with the nomad, Generation X, and similarly in generations before. That's what they do. So the prophet tends to be like this strident, this is how we should do it. Nomad comes around, becomes a lot more rebellious in young adult life, and they're seeking the new thing. The hero generation comes after that. They're likened to the GI generation before. Statesmen, scientists, economists, diplomats, builders. These are the folks that build the infrastructure for the new cycle. They bring community, technology, affluence there. The millennials are, if they come to pass, and if the big secular crisis, like a war or something big happens, they are the generation that will need to respond to it. And similar to the GI generation, which they were told to be like they were a bunch of slackers, and no one knew what would happen with them. And then when World War II came and they responded, they became the generation that sort of built all the infrastructure in America, really. And so yeah, they're likened to them. And then the artist generation, or the iGens or Gen Z, they bring out the artists, the lawyers, the therapists, legislators, statisticians. They tend to be experts. They are really due process or social justice minded. They really care about being fair. And so this is like sort of how this plays itself out. And then you can see then, as these folks have different stages of life, they sort of create a particular turning. And when you have prophet elders, like currently, nomad midlifers, hero young adults, and artist children, then actually that creates the crisis era. And in the crisis era in American history, there's no crisis era in American history that didn't have a financial crisis and a secular crisis, like a major conflict that they were a part of. And so given all of that, it's funny, in the crisis era, basically a lot of basic old political parties, those alignments get realigned. This is according to theory. The sense of fair play goes away because the artists are the justice folks. They're not elders, and when their voice sort of disappears, then people stop caring about fair play. They tend just to do their own thing. It's a time of fighting and fracturing. And when somebody wins at the end of a crisis era, then you end into a more of a conformist high era. But a lot of the stuff that we're feeling right now is the stuff that they predicted back in 91. So it's a fascinating theory. Now, what does this have to do with us? So then spiritual question of the day, doing an overlay of the spiritual questions and given those callings and endowments, that's sort of where I came up with these things. And so then you have the boomers, 43 to 60. We don't have any boomers, right, on this call? Everyone, I think Scott's an older Xer, I think.
Yeah, 63, and tend to identify with Xers, but probably straddle that line.
That's right. And yeah, some others have it from like 46 to 64. That's another boundary that they've seen. So you're right on that cusp. And what's more important, and Scott's a good picture of that, is that not necessarily where does your birth year fall, but which generation do you identify with is probably a better way to think about it. This is like terminology. Now, boomers grew up, they're still a modern generation. They still believed in something called absolute truth. They actually did believe as a prophet generation that if they found something that was worth chasing, the truth that was worth chasing, then you would change your entire life around it. They've got books like The Road Less Traveled and other kinds of things that sort of was this inner seeking and inner adventure. I think Thomas Merton, was he also potentially in that same realm, whether you sought a truth and once you found it, you latched onto it and grabbed it. And I think then their spiritual question of the day is, what is true? They, if you wanted to really be effective with them, actually, so if you're having spiritual conversations with them to engage people who aren't yet Christian in boomers, then you're actually trying to set up an argument that the Christian faith is true, right? So if you can sort of prove through logic or apologetics that Jesus actually roamed on the planet, that Jesus actually died and he rose again, that the scriptures we have are very close to the scriptures that were written and reliable. And if you can make enough of a case to say that Christianity is true, then you had an audience. People wanted to hear what you had to say. When the generation is in their 20s and 30s, they get the cultural limelight, so it actually then becomes the larger cultural question. And if you remember the critique of Christianity in the 60s and 70s, most of it was around that Christianity was not true. That creationism, science, all of that has proved that you just believe in a myth, in a superstition, in a fantasy, and it's not grounded in any truth at all. And this was the conversation that they were having. So much so then, I think that's what their spiritual question of the day, and that's why they chase it. That's why the scriptures are so important to the boomers in a way that it's not, doesn't have the same place with other generations. You'll hear older boomers saying like, well, they don't care about the word of God anymore. And this is very much in line with their spiritual question of the day. That's what you do. That's why, you know, having big, large evangelistic events, that makes sense to boomers. Just be really efficient at getting the information out on what is true. Because boomers inherently, once they find it, would change their life around it. So that's the what is true thing. We don't have any boomers on this call, so can't verify that. But when you go around, they're like, oh, yeah, totally. What is true is a big deal for them. Do you sense that for older boomers that you know? Yep, maybe. All right. Xers are a different breed. First fully postmodern generation. So now truth became less objective, more personal and relative. Born between 61 and 81. And that's most of this call, right? Xers on this call. Xers looked at their parents and they said, we don't want their lives. They live to work, but we work to live. We saw them and we saw their marriages falling apart with skyrocketing divorce rates. We saw a culture moving from G rating to R rating. The AIDS scare was kicking in. It was a time where just everything seemed like it was going down south. Economy was tanking. People were having a hard time finding jobs. All the institutions around them were failing them. And the generation could be marked, if you had to choose a word to mark it, you could use the word distrust. That the things that other boomers sort of took for granted, we didn't trust at all. And so families, churches, schools, whatever, none of that was getting us to where we wanted to go. And so we just wanted to go instead, we need to survive, hunker down, find community. And for Xers, community was an end in and of itself. We just want to go where everyone knows our name. And so we just there's a place where we just didn't want to hear from the parents or from the older generation anymore. We just tribed up, where boomers might have grown up watching Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. We had Friends and Cheers and shows that talked about the tribe. And so there was that. And because of our mistrust, Xers are the best BS detectors on the planet. We know when someone's trying to throw a script or something like marketing or propaganda, anything that smells like big business to us, we have an anathema, allergic reaction to it. The birth of organic churches and smaller communities, right, came with Xers, and we're there asking all the questions to deconstruct Christianity, because that's what nomads do. Because of that mistrust and because of that BS detector, I actually think then our spiritual question of the day is what is real as opposed to what is true. We don't want to hear arguments about Christian faith. They're like, oh, that works for you. Great. Doesn't work for me. Instead, we want people to be real with us, right? So when they were in their cultural heyday, 80s and 90s, what had to shift in terms of engaging people who weren't yet Christian? In that time as an Xer, I remember bringing one of our apologists, in a varsity one, to our campus, MIT. And we put him on the student center steps in the main part of campus. And what he did was he just kept picking fights with everybody, asking questions and trying to get them baited, and then try to make them look dumb in front of the crowd, that their views were inconsistent or illogical. And by the end of those times, our students were like, we kind of side with the people asking you questions. Those are legitimate questions. Why are you blasting on them? And there was a real shift where that strategy wasn't working. And so what did we do, right? To ask this question, Doug did a lot of the pioneering work here. We had the edge, and we had people going up to the front, sharing very vulnerably and authentically about the struggles that they have in their lives. We're going to air out our dirty laundry and then show how Jesus meets us in the mess. And if we can do that authentically, then we have an audience. Do you remember what the critique of Christianity was in the 80s and 90s? Right? It was a time when our televangelists were falling from grace, having all kinds of immoral acts. And so the critique wasn't necessarily around what is true, though that was still happening on the side. It was much more that your Christian leaders do not walk their talk. And so because of that, you're a bunch of hypocrites. We don't want to listen to you. And you could hear, even in the critique, they're asking their spiritual question. What's authentic? What's real? And so we just want people to be real with us. Xers, don't argue with me. Can you just drop your masks for a second? Can I just see behind that script? If you show me who you really are, then I'll trust you. We spent a lot of times as staff to Xers in coffee shops just building enough trust by being real so that they'd let us influence their lives. And that is, I think, the spiritual question of the day. Xers, does that connect with you all? Yep. And Xers are going to be the ones that will most resist labels and generalizations. So there you go. Because you're real. Millennials, 82 to 02, millennials. Is that Grace? The only millennial. They look at us and they're like, you know what, you guys, stop just looking at your own communities. Let's do something, man. They came in, according to Strauss, a civic generation, much more engaged, much more external, much more wanting to do something. Where Xers grew up as latchkey kids, we had to open up our latchkey because the key was latched to our belt loops, and we let ourselves into our house. We often had to cook for ourselves. We had to look out for ourselves. We were allowed to run out in the street, do whatever we want, as long as we got home by dark. Millennials, however, gave birth to or were parented by helicopter parents. So their lives were much more scheduled, more extracurricular activities. They were kind of used to getting together on sports teams and other kinds of clubs. So where Xers community was an end in and of itself, millennials achieved through community. Community was a team, and you achieved or scored or won, but you did something with them. They're pretty optimistic. Through them, a lot of the because of their sort of concern for the world and wanting to engage it, this is where social marketing started to come to play, where if you bought a pair of Warby Parker glasses, you get a free pair and we'll give it to the poor, or you buy a pair of Tom shoes and they'll give it away. And, regardless of whether that's actually good for the economy that they're dumping their shoes upon. that was driving a lot of the marketing. American Idol. If you vote and send in your text, then we'll send mosquito nets to Africa. But it was also a very narcissistic generation where technology fueled a lot of it. They invented the selfie. So my joke about millennials, if I'm being snarky, is that your patron saint is Bono, because you could be like rich and famous and still do a lot of good in the world. And so they really want to contribute. They want to see how they can get involved. And I believe their spiritual question of the day is, what is good? And we found a lot of engagement, less in the dirty laundry airing and more in sort of engaging the world, whether it's seeking justice, trying to fight sex trafficking, bringing relief after Hurricane Harvey and Katrina. The New England region, right, would bring hundreds of students down to Katrina, down New Orleans and now Houston. Half of them would be non-Christian. Right, and so many of them would become Christian through this service project. It was their most evangelistically fruitful area time, and we just found a lot. Price of life would start to sort of take off, and a lot of the things that we were doing was engaging around this question. Then, if you present a gospel, this is sort of where my hook was. If you present a gospel that's primarily about your benefits in the afterlife, you can see how you're missing this generation. Right, and sharing a gospel that isn't necessarily fully biblical, or at least the whole revelation of it. So, and the critique. So these folks had this the cultural limelight in the noughts, 2000s, and then the teens. And what's the critique of Christianity today? It isn't necessarily around what is true, and not necessarily around like, is it fake or not? Though those are still around. The biggest issue is it really good or not? Right? The narrative is, if people were less religious, we would be less intolerant, less bigoted. We would get along. Terrorism would drop. We would stop. Sectarian violence would go away because we wouldn't be so crazy into our own religion. If we could just lower our religious zeal and learn to get along, then maybe this world would be a better place. Bestsellers from the New Atheists, like God is not great. Religion itself is a poison that is bad for community. I mean, these are such new ideas. Like, nowhere in the history of mankind up until the last 40, 50 years, that kind of idea would be considered madness. And yet it's getting played today. This idea that religion is not good. That there's a study that came out, I think 10 years ago, 2007, Barna, that said a majority of Americans, 56%, believe that radical Christianity is just as threatening to America as radical Islam. Right? It is religion that is the problem. So that's, I believe, their spiritual question of the day. What is good? And they're looking, how can we contribute? Grace would be our only person to verify that. Is that true? Now, the iGens, 2003 on, they'd be called Gen Z. We'll see what name actually sticks for them. But they're now, according to Jean Twenge, Gen Z is already in college. According to Strauss and Howe, they're just about to go to college. And we're sort of right in between where the culture is shifting around them. This is the artist generation. And they're different than the millennials, as we're already starting to see. They tend to, by generational theory, they tend to be experts at everything. They take everything and become better at it. They sort of thrive on what the millennials build, according to generational theory. Artists thrive on what the heroes build. And then the generation after them, as they present like the prophet vision, they sort of look to them for moral guidance. But in between, they're really just seeking to outdo millennials. So you did it this way, we're just going to do it better. And they have all kinds of access and affluence and technology at their fingertips. The idea that you can make a studio quality movie on your phone. You can make a studio quality track of music on your laptop. Technology is making us do better than we've ever done. Back in the day when we were growing up, Xers, and we went to college, and it was cutting edge to have the overhead projector, man, to have the acetate transparency to stick that on, and you left the cords on it. They were janky, but man, that was so cutting edge. Wow, you're not doing hymn books. You know, now if you do that kind of stuff, people will think you're lazy. iGens were like, I could do that on my phone, like right now. We could make this better. And that's kind of what they bring to the table. They want to do everything better, and they want everyone to feel like it's fair. Inclusivity is always a big thing for the artist generation. So the previous artist generation, the silent generation, every leader of the civil rights movement came from that generation. And you're seeing the iGens. They're going to be like that. Like, it's evil or wrong to keep people out. They'll be very inclusive and thus looking for due process for everyone, or social justice for everyone. And they just tend to take things all the way to the nth level. They'll be the good politicians. They'll learn how to do things. And in so doing, they're actually just trying to do it better. Where Xers did it differently, I just want to do it better. And they are much more conformist. They're less willing to take risks. In every 4 cycles, this is what the artist crew is like. And the iGens, by the looks of it, look very similar. But just generally, everything's like going crazy. If millennials had helicopter parents, I think iGens will have drone parents, just straight up hovering. I was talking to a tennis coach here in the South Bay who said that she secretly put tracking devices on her teenage son's phone, right, to know exactly where he would be. You're like, what? In the Xer generation, we would have been so mad. But even now, a lot of iGen kids are like, yeah, well, it keeps me safe. I'm glad my parents want to know where I am. Like that kind of vibe. So they tend to be experts. They tend to be the artists. They also the generation that creates the authors and the movie makers that tend to like take cultural things to their expert ends. And so I think through all of that their spiritual question of the day is, what is beautiful? And also probably tied to the desire for a prolonged childhood. They're looking for the thing that is transcendent, otherworldly, something worthy of worship. Something that the experts might not, something that's you're trying to get to, but you may never get to. They are pragmatic. They're not the dreamer types like the millennials were, but the millennials are. But so they'll be more willing to work, more willing to put in the elbow grease, but they want to do it for something that's worthy of worship. That's sort of beautiful. There's a study that shows that websites today, the credibility of the content is not actually based on the content. It's actually based on the design of the website. Design language is the currency of almost every product. You just have to go to Kickstarter and design becomes the thing, oh, yeah. So Choung, the co-founders of Alabaster, heard me teach on this stuff and read Real Life. And actually in their marketing pitch, they'll talk about that as this being this generational question. So they made Bibles beautiful. That's really kind of their big thing. They're set to be $1 million company this year, right? Because they're selling beautiful Bibles. Now they admit their audience is like young women are their main audience. I don't know what to make of that, but they are answering that thing of like, well, Bibles are hard to read and they're boring and they don't look good. And if we can make them beautiful, it might be worthy to read. I think this is going to be the spiritual question of the day for the 20s and 30s. And what would that look like? And what kind of implication would that have for InterVarsity? So that's the generational stuff. Maybe what helps, maybe what'll help here is that I'll do I'll do a little bit of a deeper dive. I think that's what I'll do on this one here. Is that basically, so then when you're thinking about messaging to each of the generations, particularly as your teachers of the scripture, I have this other whole talk on all that role of scripture and preaching effectiveness and how do you do that for each generation. But if I could just give an example, if I take, so I was preaching out of Luke chapter 18 and I taught basically the stories of the tax collector and the Pharisee as the Pharisee says, thank God I'm not like this tax collector. The tax collector says, just have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. And Jesus justifies the tax collector, right? And Luke says in that passage, he tells you what the story means. It's like, for those who were self-righteous and held others in contempt, he told this story. And then it's followed by a story where the disciples are trying to keep the little children away from Jesus. And Jesus says, unless you're don't let them come. And unless you're like a little child, you can't actually come into the kingdom. You have to be like a child to enter. So I was teaching those two passages at San Diego's Regional Student Conference. And that was one talk, putting that together. So I've shared that because like you could preach that passage very differently to each of the generations. Like, so to boomers, if you're preaching that passage, you probably would go straight up and saying like, well, look, the text says for those who are self-righteous and hold others in contempt, stop, because you will not be justified before Jesus. In fact, instead, take a mirror to your own self. Don't judge others, judge yourself first, right? Let the measuring stick be used on you, and stop holding others at contempt. So Jesus told you not to do it. Let's stop. This is the way forward. Stop doing it. Lay down contempt because God doesn't want it, right? And sort of preaching that to boomers, that's a way that you're like, yeah, okay, it's the truth. I will change my life around that truth. I might show an example of how contempt breaks up marriages or something, but that's kind of what you would get at. For Xers, I might shift that, right? Instead of a strident tone to it, I might start this way. Well, you know, when I was driving on the 5 and this car cut me off, I just had all these thoughts. And they were driving a BMW, and I was like, what? This driver thinks he's so like owns the whole road that he's just gonna cut me off and then eat up the fast lane like that. That's like, and I just found myself going into that cycle of contempt. I just didn't see that person as a person anymore. And I don't do that just in driving. I do that in my life. I do that in my work. I do that all the time. And Jesus is asking me to lay that down. Wouldn't you also lay that down with me? Right? It's an Xer call, being authentic, being open. To millennials, I might flip it. I might say like, you want to change the world, but your contempt is killing your communities. You're judging people around you, and so you can't work together anymore. Why not lay contempt so that you can actually change the world? This is keeping you from doing the thing that God wants you to do. Don't dream small, dream big. Kill your contempt and change the world. All right, that's how I might preach it to millennials. For the iGens, this is how I preached Luke 18. I said that I was talking to people who weren't Christian in the room and saying, you know what? Your contempt is keeping you from learning. And your contempt is keeping you from hearing from people you don't want to hear from. And what if then, because of your contempt, you're not listening to religious people around you, and that they have access to a world that you know not of, but you're not tapping into that because you hold them in contempt? And what if they actually have access to a world that's enchanted? It's full of wonder, where the Spirit soaks the world with all of its meaning and purpose and wonder. And you don't have access to that because you're contempt? My challenge to you is that your contempt is actually keeping you from wonder. And what could you do to lay it down to be able to learn from people who follow Jesus? Right? It's an appeal to transcendent. It's an appeal to things that are beautiful. This is a part of it. You know, people who come to those kinds of conferences are already kind of open. But of the 31 people who weren't followers of Jesus at that conference, 27 of them became Christian. Right? And just really cool the way you could feel in the room once they started talking about wonder. It just went click. And like they were all there. So in some ways, the iGens, that language of beauty, wonder, enchantment, sort of playing around with language that speaks of something that's different and different and otherworldly, and seeing how that's connecting with the generation. All right. So that's the first part of it. The second part is not nearly as long. The second part is not nearly as long as the first part. But do you have any questions at this point?
Like, I just have a bunch of questions about what this means for the kinds of tools we create and what it means for like our apologetics. Because I was thinking a lot about how I remember the days of Cliff Knechtle. I remember the fights in the quad, and
yeah.
So it was like, oh yeah, I can really see that a boomer had a great apologetic for boomers, but was missing the generation that just wanted what was real and wanted community, right? And so I don't know, I have all these questions. I don't know if this is the exact time to ask them, but I have a lot of questions about like even the 5 thresholds. It was created by Xers in an Xer era, And is it time for a new 5 thresholds?
Right, those are the kinds of questions. Those are great, and we could spend a lot of time exploring those. I actually think even on the big story, it was really created for millennials, right? And is there a translation there that needs to be made for iGens? I hope every generation finds a way to contextualize the gospel, staying true to the scripture, but finding ways to connect with that. So yeah, that's a lot, and a lot of our early attempts at the proxies sort of had some of that in mind. They picked up the beauty language for the colorblind proxy. What is beautiful, what is broken. Using art as a draw. If you're noticing, a lot of the proxies coming out are really pressing into the artist stuff that's coming out. Urbana, actually, Ruth heard this talk, brought in what is good and what is beautiful as 2 of the values that directed Urbana. And you could see how that played itself out. Jason Thomas was saying, like, his daughters noticed on the night of the choir that Beth Paz, I think that's her name, was dressed in white, that the choir was dressed in white, that there were other elements, and the passage, I think, was about Jesus dressed in white. And they actually noticed, Elena and the Thomas daughters, they both noticed, and Priya, they both noticed the color scheme, right? And saw how that was playing into the theme, and saw how wonderful that was, right? In a way that I don't think we would have cut. You know, I sort of like, just tell me how to do this, man. Quit making it all beautiful. Just let's get to brass tacks. This big church business, you know. So all of this it is very fascinating how it shifts based on this generational theory. So this sort of another rabbit trail was like, at the time when I wrote the dissertation, Emergent Village was really on the ascendancy. But it was run by a bunch of Xers. And when I interviewed Tony Jones, the leader of Emergent Village, he said, like, if all we do is deconstruct, then we fulfilled our purpose. And I remember thinking when I heard that line, I was like, oh, Emergent Village will not connect with millennials at all, right? Because they're just asking the questions. The Xers are great about asking the questions to get at what is real down at the bottom, but millennials want you to build something that will be for something good. And so I predicted in my dissertation that Emergent Village would lose its influence in a generation, right? And millennials don't even know who they are.
That's the question.
Yep.
Have you thought about generational theory and collaboration styles? Last week we talked about collaboration, and what I began to realize is we've never been trained on it. So people are now using, in fact, we like the word so much, we named the thing collaboration. And I'm sitting there kind of scratching my head, like, we each have totally different definitions as to what that means or what that looks like.
Yep.
How do the generations collaborate differently?
That's a fantastic question. And there's a lot of overlap. You'll find, I was hinting a little bit at it earlier in the call, right? If you have Xer leaders, they're going to want to ask, how is this authentic? So, right, finding out that this was from God, it was a kind of a big deal, right? That it wasn't just something to plant our flag everywhere. They needed to know where this was coming from spiritually. They also wanted to know how this was going to play out practically. Because, like, you've got this dream, but exactly how are we supposed to live this out? Xers will be less likely to conform, right? So trying to get somewhere with Xers is trickier because we all want to do our own thing. Xer leaders are more willing to sort of say, we're not going to play with the rest of the crew. I just want to do my own thing. I want to be innovative on my own terms and my own turf. Because that's sort of what we bring. We bring innovation. We bring sort of the new thing. But in our downside is that we tend to do it on our own terms and not really care sometimes about even the morality of it. This is when you're unredeemed. But even the impact that it might have on the rest of the organization. So so trying to get an Xer, let's say, to collaborate then, to follow is trickier. Then as they're relating to millennials who want the big dream and how this is going to change the world, the Xers aren't always going to give that kind of pitch, where millennials will need to hear that almost every month on how this work right now, my emails is connecting to this, how I'm changing the world for good. And they're going to want to be engaged. They want to be involved. They want to be in the C-suite now. So why aren't they involved in this discussion? I mean, does it make sense that you would make all these decisions up there, right? Shouldn't I be involved? We all have a say. That's what the internet does, right? Democratizes our voices. The iGens will be looking then like at your policies and your decisions and say like, is this fair for everyone? Is this really beautiful? Is this the kind of community we want to become? Right, and sort of our human sexuality rollout, I think as much as it was tough on the millennials, it'll be tougher on if that happened like 5, 10 years later, that could have been a major blowout in our ministry. But that's a question they're going to have, and how are we going to deal with that? So yeah, each one's going to come with a little bit of a different angle of what they want, what they need. Each generation has different sort of needs. iGens will be willing to work more than millennials were in terms of doing the harder thing, but they will also be, what's the word? Because of this kind of conservative due process and other things, they're going to be more, I'm going to use this word, but I don't mean it in a pejorative way, all right? Like sensitive. And I don't mean that like, oh, they're so sensitive. What I mean is they're just going to be more aware of those things. And well, for them, emotional safety is equated to physical safety. Does that make sense? So if they feel emotionally unsafe, it triggers them in a way that we might be triggered if we were physically unsafe. And hence, therefore, unlike the Xers who are willing to rock the boat, iGens want safe spaces where, and for them, sometimes that means they don't want to hear an opposing voice because that's making them feel unsafe. Right now, right on college campuses, it's crazy, right? Like safe spaces are a big thing right now. And the amount of conformity or like speakers being disinvited because they're causing issues on the campus, basically iGens are going to complain to the head administrators if they're not doing something to make them feel safe. So if you imagine that coming into the workplace and you have iGen supervisees, and you do something just unthinking that makes them feel unsafe, the triggers are going to go boom, and you're going to find an emotional response with the iGens in a way that you hadn't seen before. And so as supervisors of iGens, particularly area directors, they may need to start watching that. The emotional tenor is going to be high, and the need for, and the need as well as the openness to getting help from mental health professionals is going to go up. So I know you're asking particularly like when they're in the same room, how do they respond? I'm sort of filling out the context in the back to let you say like that's all influencing who they are at the table. And then if you could do things that could trigger a different generation, or you could do things that would make people feel like they're not being heard, or you could chase a dream without approaching it from a sense of reality, or you can do it without making it beautiful. And you can see how you'll start missing some of the motivations of generation on generations. And generation isn't the only overlay. You've got strength finders and Enneagram and other kinds of things that could help along that line, but it is one of them.
I do wonder how race and culture and gender play in the overlay of things, as well as immigration narratives.
Yeah, I think you said, it was hard to hear you, but you're saying you were wondering about how race and ethnicity, gender overlay on this? Yeah.
As well as immigration narratives. Like, how does the global story fit into this larger piece? Which is very American, but America is very broad.
No, it's a great question. I get it every time I teach it. I can't say that I've done any studies on it, so that's hard to say. But sort of this stuff, when I'm teaching it in Singapore or Thailand in the slums or Japan, so I guess I'm in more affluent Asia, it's holding. It'd be interesting to see if it holds in Ethiopia. But even just sort of snippets of like, oh, it would make sense that sort of the Chinese optimism and the Arab Spring would happen with the hero generation, millennials. And there does seem to be a sense where that kind of stuff was happening, right? And sure, there's going to be cultural shifts, like a Canadian millennial might have a lot of Xer mixed in, right? Because they don't have the same kind of, they didn't grow up in a hegemony, right? There's always their big brother down to the south type of thing. So They'll have some extra vibe, but they still have a lot of millennial vibe. You know, sure, there's cultural and ethnic and gender overlays that nuance it, but more often than not, I'm seeing a lot of it holding more globally these days. And that might be precisely because of the access to different technology and the way that's connecting the world.
James, I invited a 21-year-old to the missions leadership team to sort of reflect and just to corroborate your sensitivity thing. She actually used that phrase when asked, how do you think you're seen by older people? She said, I think older people see me and my generation's sensitivity as a liability versus a superpower.
Yeah.
Versus an asset. Like, we're actually, sensitivity is actually a really great trait. And we can see things and feel things that others can't, and that is a superpower, but it's viewed as a liability, as a downside to us.
That's right. That's right. And well, every strength has its weaknesses, so that it does cut both ways. But it's also true that older generations tend to look, they judge the up and coming generations based on their own grids. So that is true. But the prophet generation will grow up in response to this artist generation, precisely around that. The artist generation of the four, I actually forgot to mention this, is the most secularizing generation of the four. In part because of their inclusivity, their due process, they also, of the four, tend to be the one that, and their sort of career track and that mentality to make it, they tend to be more about material needs, kind of the things that they can see in front of them, and less about the spiritual. And so children who grew up in their shadow then come out, the prophets come out, and hence the spiritual awakening.
So when we think about the 2030 calling, that gives it a strange bend, right? Here we are, 2030 falls firmly within the artist generation. We're inviting the revival of God into a most secular generation. Shouldn't it be the 2060 calling? To the next one after?
You know, and there might be, there's always, you know, revivals don't always take the same shape, nor do they have the same force, right? And this will be coming soon in our book, Longing for Revival, at Varsity Press. That you have the Richter scale, and you can have a 1 or a 5, a 1.0 and a 5.0, and those are very different earthquakes, but they're still earthquakes as they measure on the Richter scale. And as we chase our 2030 calling after revival, I think it's right for every generation to seek revival. We're not going to be fatalistic about that. But at the same time, sure, we don't know what the Lord will do. If you buy theory, sure, you know, when people who grew up in the Jesus movement, sort of the last big one, it's qualitatively different. We've had a lot of revivals along the way, and especially in other parts of the globe. So, but for America, like, you know, anyone who's in their 70s or so and they're Christian and they were Christian at the time, you know, if you ask them like, what was the best time spiritually? Yeah, they'll always point to the Jesus movement. Almost any major leader in a denomination will point to that time. It was like, we just walked into a coffee shop and told them about Jesus and everyone was becoming Christian. It was just like on a different vibe than what we're feeling now. That said, you don't want to fall into a fatalism. We keep being faithful. We seek the Lord for it. In part, though, I do wonder sometimes, and I think our move into volunteers and partners is a smart move if you're taking generational theory strongly. If you're taking it, because I think, you know, the iGens are probably going to be less likely to take the big risk. So for them, they kind of have to see that it's possible and doable, and you're helping them along, but have millennial volunteers coaching and changing the world. That seems wise to help kind of the next generation do the work. But they're going to feel really different than the previous generation of students, right? That as a whole, you'll always have people that are on the side or different, but as a whole, The sensitivity is good. It is a superpower. It will also slow things down. And what does that mean? Right? So that's just there. It's not, again, none of this is meant to say this is how it's going to be. So it is shared, so it will be done. It's not like that at all. It's just really to help you see what they are about, what motivates them, and who knows? The Lord may still bring revival in a way that we did not expect.
I think if I were preaching 2030 to millennials, I would emphasize catalyze movements. But to iGens, I do think the word revival can have an artistic and an environmental and personal beautification kind of application. And so I do think catalyzing movements might really motivate millennials, but I do think a revival of the arts or revival of the renewal of all things does have the potential for a iGen or artistic bent.
Fully agreed. It's our most qualitative word, and revival is actually being used in our culture almost everywhere. Like Selena Gomez and Eminem both have albums called Revival. Revival shampoo, revivals on Broadway, revivals. There's sort of this thing right now where revive or revival is on everything from shampoo to soap to it has a sense. And in a crisis era, when you just feel like everything is going to pot, there will be an attractiveness to life and beauty. Yeah. Well, let's see. I'm out of time. So maybe I'll just sort of tease you. Consider this a teaser if you want more, because I'm not going to be able to go into any of it. But as I move forward, the deeper dive would have gone into the positive and negative aspects of each generation, and what the artists' generations are like. And then what I would have done is gone more into Jean Twenge's work and talked about the 10 characteristics that she talks about in iGens, which is very fascinating. We'll leave it at that. You can tell me if this is what you want, or we can kill it. And then how this then plays itself out with the artist generation as improvers, and then some real practical advice on what to do with iGens. And that's what I have.